Ladies and gentlemen, my fellow feathers in arms, welcome back to the Rabbit Holes That Quack, episode number 9. You're mostly related to today's documentary, Framing Britney Spears podcast. I am one of your hosts, Brandan Jones, and joining me downstream on this adventure, the woman, the myth, a quack who seems of sound mind, Miss Nicole Matthews.
Hello, listeners.
And if you were just joining us well into our post-apocalyptic future or in near real time, welcome. This is a podcast where Nicole and I subject ourselves to a random documentary each week and let that be the springboard for a larger conversation about the issues therein. If you'd like to drop a particular documentary into the hat for us to choose from, we'll be choosing them from amongst our patrons at patreon.com/Pandora's Quack, where you can also submit broader topics, comments, and questions for both this and our other sister podcasts, such as The Conversations That Quack, where co-host Ephraim Garcia and I do a weekly deep dive into the issues facing the Black movie protagonist. But if joining Patreon is not in the cards for you right now, that is more than okay. Feel free to share, rate, and review us on the free podcasting service of your choice and or YouTube, and stick around for our other upcoming shows. And so, listeners, my fellow feathers in arms, without further ado, these are the rabbit holes that quack. Tonight's featured documentary is Framing Britney Spears. Framing Britney Spears is a documentary featuring her rise as a global phenomenon, her downfall as a cruel national sport, and about the people close to Britney Spears and lawyers tied to her conservatorship, now reassessing her career as she battles her father in court over who should control her life. It was directed by Samantha Stark, for whom this is her first documentary, and it was written by Liz Day, a senior story editor for the New York Times. As of this recording, because of sort of the way this documentary sits, listeners, I was actually explaining this to Ephraim earlier, it's inside of a longer series. It's called The New York Times Presents. It's on Hulu. It's sort of like a episodic kind of thing. I believe this was either episode 6 or 7, airing in February. They just had a recent episode that actually ties into our very first premiere episode, Fake Famous, about influencer culture and all that kind of stuff. So if you were looking for this and you're unable to find it, that is how you can do so. There's also, I think, a couple other documentaries out there, but this specifically will be kind of through the lens of that episode, Framing Britney Spears. So listeners, last week we finally left the West Coast behind. Took our Extreme the California Central podcast east to Harlem, New York to discuss the context and the history behind Harlem's The Apollo. But this week we will be taking our cues straight from the headlines by diving into the world, of course, of Britney Spears, but also the lens of some of the recent news that's come out about her conservatorship and just sort of the culture and society kind of taking a second look at this woman who seems to be almost have been dismissed. Nicole, how familiar would you say just generally you are familiar with the term conservatorship? This is something that I've seen like coming up online a lot after her testimony, and really just people kind of being like, what is this? How, in broad strokes, do you know what it is? It's obviously you've kind of gotten a sense because of the documentary, but did you have any idea before the documentary, I guess I should say, of what that meant?
Yes, I definitely did, just because pretty much everything in this documentary was something I was following in real time.
Yeah.
So I think for me, I first became aware of conservatorships because of Britney Spears. And I remember when all of that kind of went down, there was just a lot in the news at that time trying to kind of explain what they were. I think they were probably even giving other examples of them, even though I don't really remember any notable ones. But yeah, that was something that, I was kind of tracking as it was happening.
Yeah, so I think I understood it in broad strokes, but ironically, the movie that actually really painted a picture for me about it, not only how easy it seems for someone to be put into one, but how difficult it seems to get out of one, was actually the movie that we saw, I Care a Lot, starring Rosamund Pike. And for listeners that don't know, it's a movie about a con woman who essentially finds seniors and essentially cons them into these sort of conservatorships and lives off of their estates. It's sort of a, preying on people who don't necessarily know better. The people who you hear about, the senior citizens who, someone calls frantically needing money because of, an outstanding warrant. Those are my favorite ones that I get. Things like that nature, and they ultimately lose things. With regards to Britney Spears, however, how much were you aware of sort of her situation? So, I presume that you had kind of followed it in real time, but like real time in the sense of let's call it over the course of kind of the 12, 13 years or more, just once the documentary kind of came out, obviously back in February, or some of the spikes that have gone. Like, have you, I guess to say, followed her career over the course of this, or was it really kind of like she went in and then once the, Free Britney movement kind of started, you became a little bit more tuned into it?
No, I definitely would say very real time, to the extent that, I watched this documentary, I think, closer to when it first aired, and then I watched it again this week knowing that we were going to be talking about it. And I think for me, I have followed her so real time in a way that watching this, I think, both times has been extremely painful, because I do feel somewhat complicit in all of it, which I think a lot of people probably do, if you were someone that was sort of paying attention during that time. And they even show him very briefly, but I think, Perez Hilton often gets kind of wrapped up in a lot of the blame of, just how toxic this time was. And there's been some other documentaries as well, I think, that has sort of touched recently on this time period, specifically for women and what it was like. But at the same time, like, I was totally consuming his blog. And I think, in particular, watching her kind of spiral to, the bald moment, the shaving of her head, and kind of the attacking of the car. Like, I remember all of that happening. And I think, that's what is so interesting about this documentary. I think for a lot of people, it makes you sort of reflect on that time period and realize that even just through the consumption of it, we were all kind of complicit in her demise.
Yeah, it's interesting because I don't know exactly how old she is, but she's of our generation to a certain degree, which is just kind of fascinating when you think about it, just kind of the last couple decades, because I think my history with her is really just defined by maybe like 3 or 4 milestones, where there's obviously the Hit Me Baby One More Time debuting on TRL and MTV, Total Request Live for perhaps some of our younger viewers. All of the Pepsi stuff that kind of happened, the partying, of course, with Paris Hilton and Lindsay Lohan, and kind of, that era. And then, of course, the shaved head. And, of course, the guy who famously cried in that video of, I'm not even sure exactly how that video, I feel like that predates social media. I might be wrong about that, but just the guy who's, screaming, "Leave Britney alone," that obviously became a punchline and spoofed to death afterwards. And then I more or less lost track of her until, hearing about a residency in Vegas. And I was only kind of understood what that was because of the, Celine Dion's been there for a while. I think that might have ended. But I don't think I ever saw a healthy debate about what was going on with her at any point until watching this documentary. And I forgot what the guy's name was, or kind of what his role was, but the black pundit that was kind of featured in the documentary. And he was kind of saying, there wasn't mental health back then. There wasn't all these things that we would kind of consider maybe, or talk about maybe now, which is a question I'll kind of ask you a little bit later, that would actually sort of give light to what was kind of going on. But yeah, it's an interesting sort of situation, but curious to know how much you're kind of like following that. Because, this is kind of something that's just like of celebrity culture, but obviously Britney Spears is kind of the one that's sort of the lightning rod right now because of all the sort of extenuating circumstances.
Well, I mean, again, I think the documentary does a decent job of trying to illustrate what it was like in terms of, the paparazzi scene, and also what a lot of these celebrity magazines were doing. I never actually bought those magazines. I would like read them if they were, like places that I happened to be. But, by that time, like, we have to remember, and again, like referencing Perez Hilton, that was like, obviously the internet was around.
Yeah.
And I think that a lot of like blogs were becoming really popular at that time, and they were sort of the online version, of the Us Weeklies, and the People magazines. So I think if you were someone that followed that world at all, it was really kind of hard not to see it because she was everywhere. And, you kind of can go back and, the documentary does this to a certain extent. But really through like, just tons of photos and videos, we all did kind of watch her completely spiral out of control. And I think that's kind of like how real time, and this happens today too. I think just that sort of like the appetite and the culture around it has shifted a lot. But again, I think like if you were someone that was slightly interested in the entertainment world or followed celebrities back then, Britney was everywhere, and I think kind of as they talk about like all of her life milestones then made her even more interesting, like when she started to have kids. So it was something that I think for me, I was just constantly being hit with. And then, I think the other thing, truthfully, that probably sort of played into it a little bit is like, we also have to remember, and they did mention this was the time of, boy bands. But one of the interesting thing about boy bands was that, there was definitely this sense of like, we were all supposed to pick one, so there was like NSYNC or Backstreet Boys, and you were either one or the other. I was an NSYNC fan. So I think when Britney came out and then Christina, they kind of did the same thing to Britney and Christina, even though they were all on Mickey Mouse Club together. And so I was always a Christina fan. I never even owned Britney Spears music. I would listen to it, I would consume it. But Christina was really kind of the one whose like records I still have today. And so I think there was that other element too of like you were almost following Britney because it was like, she was really struggling more than Christina at that time, right? But then obviously Christina went on and had her own issues as well. But I think these sort of, pop stars at that time were a really big part of entertainment and celebrity culture.
Yeah. What kind of like chatter are you seeing sort of, now kind of in your circles, kind of the way that sort of people are talking about this? Because I agree, it's sort of one of those things where like I remember that era as well, where it was kind of like the boy band era. I think there's still not a day that can go by in any public setting with regards to the boy bands where someone will scream, "Tell me why," and everyone just knows what to say next, which is sort of a really kind of funny moment in just pop culture that's just ingrained in everyone's mind. But like, having followed that either passively or actively through all the mechanisms that you're talking about, like now that people are sort of taking a second look at it, what's sort of the general sense that you're seeing? Not so much from like the media, we'll kind of get there, not so much from, the documentary, but just sort of like your sense, talking to just people or overhearing things or, seeing stuff in your feed. Like what's sort of the general consensus on your end?
I mean, I haven't really talked to any friends about this, but I do think like what's interesting for me is that, as I mentioned, I did watch this closer to when it first aired. And I think obviously, the documentary, it still ends on sort of this like speculation of like what the Free Britney movement thinks might be going on. So it's kind of interesting having that context of having watched it and then now kind of realizing that like a lot of what this documentary alleges is most likely true, right? And that's kind of what we're going to see play out. So I will say when I watched it the first time, I definitely felt like I think this is true because I had already started to see a lot of things kind of just like on social or like, in previous, I guess, years having conversations with friends about like what is going on with Britney Spears. And she really has remained like sort of this icon, for her fans and for like certain segments of the population. So I think she still has like this cachet about her. So I haven't really heard like, I guess from friends what they're saying, but my general sense and just like what I've been seeing is that people are not surprised. I think this validates a hunch that, again, a lot of people had. And I think what I've been really fascinated to see is just the smaller stories that have started to come out of people that, probably had interactions that, pointed at some of this stuff, but just for like whatever reason, either, didn't say anything or knew at the time if they were going to say anything, it wasn't going to make a difference. And so as someone who still reads celebrity blogs, some of the things I've been seeing that are interesting are just, certain like music producers that have come out or, just other people in the industry that worked with her during this time period. That have kind of said, like, I thought she was drugged on set, like she was not herself, yet she still kind of like pulled out a performance or, I saw Jamie Spears, treating her in a really weird way. And he showed up with like this bimbo on his arm. And just, some of these accounts, I think, that are starting to trickle out are really interesting. And it's tough, too. I think there's also people that are clearly either, close to her or have been close to her. I think actually Christina Aguilera's statement was really interesting and kind of made me tear up a little bit, because you could tell through it that like she probably feels some sort of guilt as well, that this wasn't something that maybe she was noticing and picking up on. And I think, sort of this feeling of like, well, the least she can do now is like, make a statement about it. So I think it's been interesting to kind of see people that maybe, were looking the other way because they didn't want to confront what was actually going on, or people that knew what was going on, and now they're sort of being validated. And I think that's kind of what I've been observing.
Yeah, there's some of the pundits that I just follow generally, they just talk about pop culture and such. They, it's kind of came up on their, topic of the day and such like that. And I think for them, it was interesting because it was more of like this one in particular that I was watching. He actually kind of made the insight, I think, before I had seen the documentary where the one woman kind of mentioned it, but he just explicitly, he was like, in my experience, when a woman shaves her head, she's been abused. And he's like, that's just one for one kind of thing. And like, she's just basically like, don't touch me. Like, I'm trying to make myself undesirable. He's like, they may get a bunch of piercings, they may get a bunch of tattoos and all this kind of stuff. And it's a comedic podcast, so they kind of went down the line for that. But like, that was kind of just sort of the springboard for that. And then obviously sort of in the documentary, there's a woman who kind of says like she did the same thing to kind of just get, how do I not be the sort of center of attention? So there's like some of that stuff that I was seeing where people were kind of looking at her behavior not as indulgent from her standpoint, the way that, the presumption, would be that, the way that like Paris Hilton was kind of like partying and like, I want to say Nikki. It's not Nikki. Wasn't her name? What was the sort of the girl that was always with her? They did that show together. Nicole Richie. That's what it was. Yeah. So it's like her, where they're just kind of basically just just having fun and just kind of like whatever's whatever sort of situation. I think looking at it more from, they were kind of saying, it seems like with Britney, she was just sort of surviving kind of what was going on with her sort of thing. But then you also look at some of these apologies that are coming out, and like, I don't know, it's one of those things where like, I kind of hate's a strong word. I just don't really particularly like some of these apologies that come out like decades later, because I get it. I get the sort of like optics of it. I get the PR of it. I get there's probably like genuine feelings and all that kind of stuff, but it's like Justin Timberlake kind of coming out sort of saying stuff like what you're talking about with Aguilera. Paris Hilton, I think, kind of like said some stuff. And it's kind of one of those things where it's like, I don't know. I kind of hate the culture of ask for forgiveness instead of like ask for permission kind of thing. And I feel like that's kind of what like some of that is, where people are kind of like now all of a sudden with maturity kind of looking back and being like, oh, we were kind of like mean to that person. It's kind of just reminds me of, people who are like, bullies on in schoolyards and all that kind of stuff in elementary school and all that stuff. And then like getting older and kind of just having perspective and being like, oh, hey man, like, sorry, I kind of like went pretty hard on you. And it's like, oh no, I got it. But I don't know. I understand the context of that stuff, but it just kind of seems like it always feels hollow. Because like, even when you kind of were looking at some of the, like Tarantino's making the rounds for, I forgot exactly what, I think he wrote a book or something like that. Recently or something like that. And so I think he was asked again kind of about the Weinstein stuff, and he was kind of like said what I think everyone got, where he's like my words of I wish I would have done more, he's like, we're kind of taking it out of context. And he's like, what I meant was, he's like, I just assumed he was the guy who was like chasing his secretary around the office. And he's like, I'm not condoning that, but he's like, that's the way it was back then. He's like, had I known that he was like hurting people, I might have been inclined to sit him down and be like, hey, stop. Like, you're going to like ruin this. You're going to like destroy this. You're going to blah, 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 blah. And he's like, not for me, but like for him, like get yourself together kind of thing. But he's like, I think everyone had heard enough stories that they kind of just understood what was going on, but no one was really proactively doing anything about it. And so it's like, when you look at sort of like Britney Spears, I always think about, Kevin Hart, and he's talked about why he's been able to kind of hold sort of a center of gravity, and he just grew up with his entire crew, and they've always kind of been the same crew, the same inner circle. And it became very apparent in the documentary that like she had Felicia, I think was her name, and that was kind of it. And then like even that was kind of initially a chaperone that kind of became her good friend, but there was like not a single person for the documentary, and really just seemed like in her circle that was like, you know, in her group, she was always kind of like switching people, so there wasn't really ever that center to kind of escape to, if you will. So now with all of that,
yeah.
Oh, good. Do you wanna?
Well, I was just going to agree, with an earlier point. I think it depends on kind of who it's coming from. So like the Justin Timberlake thing pissed me off, as it did a lot of people, because I think that a lot of Britney fans blame him for, you know, certain aspects of what happened to her.
Yeah.
So I think for me, like that read less authentic, whereas like her and Christina Aguilera never really had anything, at least that the public was aware of, that was like a serious issue. You know, there was like definitely like when they were both famous, I mean, they're still famous, sorry, when they were both at the height of their fame, let's say, they were being pitted against each other. So you would hear these little stories of like, oh, whatever, like they don't like each other. But I think really in the end, like they actually were friends. So I think for me, like Christina's hit a little bit differently than Justin's. And then I also will say, just like, again, it just cracks me up how it like intertwined these people are, because I just remembered that Christina Aguilera and Justin Timberlake went on tour together, and I saw that concert. It was called the Justified Stripped Tour.
I will agree with your earlier statement, back when they were famous, and then we'll move on. I'll let that hang out there. So now the stage has been set. What did you think about Samantha Stark's documentary? Does she lay out a compelling argument one way or another? I feel like 2020 and 2021 were the years of conspiracy theories actually being proven true, whether it was UFOs, whether it was, you know, and this will be a loaded thing to say, but, you know, do some Googling, folks, some election discrepancies and such, just a lot of things that I think people, probably the most, probably tangible one. I remember people talking about we may end up in a world with vaccine passports, and obviously those have been considered in various countries and such, and everyone told those people that they were crazy, and so Free Britney was something that everyone was like, she's fine, like don't worry about it. Now everyone's kind of like, is she? So all of that. Does Samantha Stark's documentary, does she lay out a compelling argument with her documentary here?
I mean, I think there's different elements of the argument being made, and I think some of them we already know are true, and I think some of them at the end of the time this documentary was released, we didn't know were true, and now we have sort of some insights that can confirm that it was probably true. So I think the things that we know in the documentary, at least, you know, and this is, you know, from my perspective, but the things that we know are true is that the media, and I think consumers and consumers' obsession, you know, with celebrity culture, especially at that time, definitely, I think, contributed to Britney's sort of demise, right? Or at least, shall we say, her falling under this conservatorship. And I think that's not to say that she wasn't really dealing with probably some serious issues. I kind of disagree with you. I think probably more likely, like she really, or at least not with you, but I think whoever you were talking about was saying that she was abused. I think what's more likely is what they mentioned, Lynn Spears said, where she thought her daughter had postpartum depression. Because I think the behavior and kind of like the, you know, mood swings that can like happen with postpartum depression to me are sort of indicative of like that whole kind of umbrella car incident. But again, like we'll never really know what was going on there. But I think that, you know, the paparazzi following her at that time, regardless of what it was actually afflicting her, did not help the situation, right? And I think all of that was happening because of a machine that we were all kind of feeding, in that photos of her had become so like valuable. And so I think that there's that argument to me is sort of like clearly laid out, and I can buy into that because, as I mentioned in the beginning, like I feel complicit in that. I remember that time. I remember reading the blog post about her. You know, no one was, if you were following it, no one was surprised when she shaved her head. Like, it was not actually a shock. It was a shocking act, and it was shocking that we had these photos of, like, you know, America's sweetheart pop star doing this. But, like, the fact that she had reached that point was not shocking. There was already a lot of, like, indication leading up to that, that, like, something was not right with her. So I think that part for me is, like, clear, you know, that went down. And it also, again, is indicative of, like, the way that, you know, women were being written about in the media, treated, interviewed at that time. I think, you know, what you kind of end on is more speculative is, like, what is actually going on with this conservatorship. I think they do make a good argument that at the very least, it's probably not something that is benefiting Britney, or that Britney actually still wants to be happening. But, you know, I wonder if we really will ever know the exact circumstances of how it came to be, you know, in the first place, and what sort of has transgressed over, like, the last 10 years. And so I think that's the part that is going to be hard. I don't know that any documentary will be able to prove that, because I don't know that we're ever really going to get those full details. I hope, because I'm sure there's some really interesting stories there. But I think even, you know, with what we've seen in Britney's, you know, recent court testimony, you know, there is a good chance that we are going to at least have a deeper understanding of what has been happening with her in these last few years.
Yeah, I mean, I do actually, you know, genuinely give her credit, knowing, of course, documentaries have a natural bias, and the footage and excerpts are curated, of course, but I think she seemed to have understood the world she lived in very, very well. And I say the reason why I sort of respect that is because I feel like she, you know, she obviously wished it was better, but understood the practicality of it, you know, the paparazzi, the invasive questions, etc. And I think that's something that I have felt is missing from the current roster, or sort of famous actresses and artists and just all these types of things, where I feel like Britney Spears came up, and especially some of those, like, younger interviews where she's probably, you know, teens, early 20s, etc. I just feel like she understood the machine. Like, she was like, this is what happens, and I can either opt into it or opt out of it, but there's kind of not really a way to do that. And I really appreciated that, because I think the problem that I see with a lot of modern day, you know, actresses and things of that nature is there's this kind of, oh, I can have everything that I enjoy, but all of the sort of negativity aspects of it, I think, you know, are oppressive to me, or they're this, or they're this, or they're this. And it's like, you're not wrong. And I think that a lot of those things and mechanisms and things need to be reevaluated and taken a look at, and such. But I think it's cool that she was like, yep, I know that you guys have to profit. I know that you guys have to take these pictures. I know that you guys have to do all this stuff. And it seemed like for a really long time, it was fine. I think the point that it sort of becomes an issue is that, of course, when it's always on and it's new, I think it's fine. I think what happens is that when people need that moment, it's impossible to get that moment, especially kind of depending on your level of fame. Like, we've seen this happen, you know, over and over and over again with, like, Ben Affleck, where it's like, these are clearly very private moments that he's having, that he's just not having a good day. He's not having, you know, a good moment, a good week, or whatever. And people will kind of jump on top of him and be like, oh, he must be drinking again. He must be this, he must be this, he must be this. And it's like, or this is just a moment where he stepped out to, like, have a smoke and just wanted to, like, take a second. And now this moment where he just thought he was taking 30 seconds of fresh air is going to now be in the news cycle. And now people are going to make fun of it. And now it's going to be part of the monologue, and it's going to be part of this and this and this. And it's one of those things where, like, I think she understood that. I think the problem that she ran into, and Shia LaBeouf has talked about this a little bit too, and kind of like what he dealt with his father kind of being a, you know, a child actor and kind of coming up, of just, I don't think she really had anyone who seemed level-headed around her. I had kind of thought that was her mother for a long time, and I think her mother, I never really got a read on her, truthfully. Like, it kind of seemed like, oh, you know, just like, you know, caring Southern mother, just archetype, just, you know, totally fine kind of thing. And then I guess as Britney got older, and she just seemed to kind of just not be present in a way that, you know, you would hope sort of a mother would be during sort of the situation, especially when Britney started to make, like, a, you know, the money that she was making. But then it's like her father, which we'll probably get to in a second, you know, I think also wasn't really that kind of like level-headed person, you know, you know, the mentor, well, you know, here's my wisdom, here's my this and this and this, you know, it's your career, but like, this is kind of what I would suggest, or this is kind of what I would do. And so it kind of creates this like situation where, as I said, I appreciate that she seems to have been like very cognizant of all of that. And I think the sort of like paradox of it is that I think if it was up to her, and she even says this in the documentary, I think she would have quit at some point and then just like been a housewife. And like, that's not even in the slightest to be like a demeaning thing. That just seemed like she was like, cool, I made my money. I got to sing. I got to travel the world. I got to tour. I got to blah, blah, blah. I'm good. Like, that's kind of like, I lived my dream, and now I'm kind of, you know, my next chapter is to go do this thing. And so like, when you hear about this conservatorship, it's like, I would imagine she went into it thinking that that was probably going to be the path. And then I think why it feels like odd is because, you know, how and why did this not so much go on for so long, but like, why is she still working this entire time? And like, that's kind of like that question that obviously I think the documentary kind of does, you know, is kind of examining from a lot of legal and kind of various kind of points of view. But all that's basically to say is I do think I appreciate how she seemed to be very aware of all of this. It's just that as it started to get out of hand, I just don't think that there's anyone in her orbit that was able to kind of have a real conversation with her, probably with the exception of that guy, the lawyer who was supposed to be the estate lawyer. I don't know if he was, it's funny, the guy's name was like Wallet. I don't think it was him though. I think it may have been, but it was the guy who basically had the blue suit, and he kind of came in off the street, and someone was like, they met at the Beverly Hills Hotel. I don't know if you remember what that guy's name was, but he basically just like, you know, he's like, she seemed fine to me. Like, she was like making coherent blah, 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 and statements. And she was like, she knew she couldn't get out of the conservatorship. She just wanted these changes and these changes. And then he was basically like told that he couldn't get out of it. And then he didn't know what he didn't know, kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why for me, it's not so much that she didn't have anyone solid around her. I think, like, to your point, like, she was solid on her own. I think she just got exploited by the people that were around her and by her talent and by the media. You know, like, I don't really think that it was like, if someone solid had been there, it would have changed things. I think she was like going to be exploited by her father and by people that knew that this conservatorship was going to be very advantageous to them and like wanted to come along on that ride. And I think that, you know, she again had a well documented kind of, you know, fall, I think, in terms of her mental health. And I think that was just used against her to kind of get her into this arrangement. And I think, you know, to your point, I agree. Like, and I think that's what's so interesting about the statements that she made in court recently. I think you're right that she just would have wanted to have kind of faded away, because that's exactly what she said, is that she wants to get married and have a child. She's 39 years old. She is in a loving relationship with a guy that she's been with for years now. And she's claiming this conservatorship doesn't allow her to do that. And I think that's a whole other level of this that people weren't really considering, because so much of the focus has been on the financial aspects and the fact that this has kept, you know, her performing and her kind of having to like keep this business running. To hear her now accuse, you know, the powers that be in this conservatorship of restricting her ability to reproduce, I think that's something that's really hit people in the last week. And hearing that she kind of can't have things that I think for a lot of people, pop star or not, are very normal things to want in life, right? To get married, to have more kids. You know, and I think for me as a woman, like, that made me really sad to hear, knowing that like she is approaching 40, and I'm sure, you know, again, she's a celebrity. She has access to anything and everything. I'm sure she'll have no problem having kids, but it is still sad to know that maybe like, you know, for the last whatever many years, this is something that she wanted and couldn't have because potentially her father was blocking her from it. I mean, that's the thing we don't know right now. And I think when you think about it in that context, it's sickening.
Yeah, it's a very Handmaid's Tale. Like, and I think the thing that why I look at it from the standpoint of why I think she needed someone like solid around her is because I always think of like Dave Chappelle. Like, it's like he's height of his career. He was doing all this stuff with the Chappelle Show. And, it was starting to hit a point where, I think his story in context I say it's changed, not to say that, he's been inconsistent with himself. I think he just like, as he, matures and gets older, he kind of looks back on it with like, sort of like, just more information or more mature wisdom kind of context sort of thing. But like, I remember, I think it's sort of like closer to when he was kind of talking about it, he was saying, the show was kind of becoming this thing that, originally it was kind of just like a funny, everyone was laughing with each other. And then it kind of became this thing where it was sort of being used to sort of make fun of Black people. And so it was kind of, the conversation was sort of turning on him. And he had the opportunity, because he had money at the time, to just walk away. Like, he just literally disappeared and everyone called him crazy, but he just disappeared. And I feel like there's a version of alternate history where Britney is not forced to, obviously kind of play all this out publicly and to keep doing all these things and keep doing all these things and keep doing all these things. Someone in her life, whether it's her father or mother or best friend or, whoever, just goes, you can just stop. And like you can just stop. You've made enough money, kind of thing. And I feel like that, just no one presented that to her. And it's like interesting, because this is kind of the inventor conversation like I was having with you when we were talking about Elizabeth Holmes. I would love to see, and they reached out to him, the documentary kind of said, they reached out to her father for comment. He's not going to comment because, I imagine anything that he would say would be used against him in a court to sort of, get him off the conservatorship. But it's like, I would like to see his perspective, because I would imagine it began as a father trying to protect their daughter. But then as time goes on, why are you as her father negotiating for, 1.5% of gross and like getting so much money type of thing, as opposed to, I don't really like need money. I just here to like, support my daughter, take care of her, blah, blah, blah. Or she just doesn't need to be doing any of this. We took a trip. We were gone for 3 years. Okay, cool. She's calm. Everything's settled. Okay, now we're going to kind of plot our comeback and tour and blah, 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 blah. So it was just one of those things where like, I find all that aspect of it particularly fascinating, because it just seems like it's very odd to tell someone you aren't allowed to handle your money and you aren't allowed to have a say over your own body, but you should keep performing and kind of making all this money. And like, that's a very incongruous thought in my mind. And as that one lawyer said, he's like, we don't know what we don't know, sort of thing. And like, I think even in the documentary, they kind of talk about there's like 5 or 6 people in that inner circle, and like, they know what they know. It's very possible that behind, closed doors, Britney may still exhibit sort of symptoms of whatever. We have no idea. And to your point, like, no documentary or any expose is really going to unfurl that. But I just think it's very strange as a society that we go, okay, if she was 60 years old, or she wasn't famous, not 60, probably like 80 years old, and she wasn't famous, they wouldn't be telling her to keep doing anything. They'd be like, okay, go sit down, you're good, relax, enjoy your life, kind of thing. Not, okay, here we're going to just keep squeezing millions upon millions upon millions out of you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that kind of, to me though, is like, that I think is why I said I feel like she's just a victim of exploitation, because I think like the reason I don't think someone solid would have helped her is the timeline of it. And I think that's something that even for me in watching the documentary, you kind of forget. But like, they go through that, and it is insane how quickly all of those events went down. And that's why I think like she was going to be exploited no matter what. Like, even if she had had someone close to her during that time, there were people that wanted to take advantage of what was happening in that situation. Like, rewatching kind of like that trip to the hospital, like the very first thing I was thinking was like, not only I remember that like she didn't want to go and she's being forced, right? But like when they're showing that footage and you see just how many ambulances and cop cars there are, like it was a circus. It was a show. Someone was making that happen. There was no need. She's one person and she hadn't done anything. She locked herself in a room. You know what I mean? Like, she hadn't injured anyone. She hadn't injured herself. And there's this stream of cars. And I just was thinking about that. Like, that to me, I don't think was something that was just like the hospitals were doing that or law enforcement was doing that. Like, there is someone that was pulling the strings on all of that. And I think it started so early on that, like, it was kind of inevitable, sadly, you know, like that she had this break and there were people around her that were like, I know what I'm going to do with this. Like, this is the time. And, you know, to your point about the business side, that's what's so shocking as well from the timeline is not only how quickly this conservatorship came into place after her hospital stay, but how quickly she was then put to work, right? Like, I think they said it was like 2 months later, she was back doing appearances and things like that. And I think, like, you know, that's another thing that, like, when looking back, you kind of forget that. But in a way, the way that we know that that's true is that she did recover her image so quickly, right? Like, she was able to continue to grow and be this really lucrative, like, a lot of her hits came after that period. So I think that part is kind of interesting as well to reflect on. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and you may be right. I just imagine part of what I'm getting at with that. So even if it's not someone homegrown, imagine, and this is going to be fantastical, listeners, imagine a world where Paris Hilton was the voice of reason. Like, it's like there were like two, like, it's like when she's hanging out with Paris and she's hanging out with Nicole Richie and she's hanging out with Lindsay Lohan, like, there is one possible, you know, branch where it's like, hey, those people just go, hey, you know, like, do you need help? Like, you know, you can like come chill and blah, 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 and such, and, you know, like reevaluate, blah, 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 because she wasn't in the conservatorship then. Secondly, if it's not that lefty guy who just seemed like the shadiest person possible, and who, like, it's like the documentary clearly was like, this guy's a mustache twirling villain, and like even the one guy was like, oh yeah, like he just shows. So I don't really have any like much more to like throw on that fire as far as I don't know who he is, I've never heard of him, kind of thing. It is odd that he still, I think they were like, as of 2019, has a restraining order, so he's clearly still hanging around for whatever reason. But again, like, if not him, someone else that comes along and is kind of like, yo, like, you can just, you know, again, insert cool whatever, you know, monologue of you can just quit, you can just whatever, blah, blah, blah. Again, slim chances. The amount of time someone needs to hear something before it actually clicks is like in the teens, I imagine. But that's all I'm trying to like suggest with that. I do want to say that it is very interesting to me to look at the media in the context of all of this, because I mentioned this quite a few times about how the scapegoat nowadays is social media. And I think that whenever anyone brings up media, like proper mainstream media, the news, it's always looked at like it's an absurd idea to say that that mechanism by which we learn about what's going on in our streets, in our neighborhoods, abroad is corruptible. And I think as a society, we just miss it. Like we're just blind to it for some reason. And so it's like, to your point, like it's in the tabloids. It's like it's almost like those, like, you know, the National Enquirers and all those kinds of things when you're shopping at a grocery store. It's funny. It's like they're almost like pop-up ads as all you're trying to do is buy some gum, and then you kind of look up and you just see like magazine cover, magazine cover, magazine cover. And I think it's one of those things where like I think there's yes, it's like you can kind of look at social media and kind of the way that there's this, you know, layer of an anonymity to it in the way that, you know, things spread so quickly, especially globally, about sort of, you know, again, to kind of go back to the Ben Affleck example of just like some of those things. Like, it's like, I remember seeing him with that like tattoo on his back and he's like on the beach and like everyone was making fun of him. And I just remember like looking at his face and I was like, I recognize that face of just the like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do next. And he's just standing there and he's just enjoying that moment. And it like, I can't imagine what it's like to be a celebrity, to like have those moments that are sort of like far and few between, and then to come back and then just get hit in the face with the fire hose of like, and here's this meme, and here's this meme, and here's this meme, and here's this meme, and all that kind of stuff. So it's interesting kind of like for that to kind of happen. Again, it's just sort of celebrity culture sort of in general, but I do think people need to have a serious conversation about the way the media does manipulate like people by the masses, and the editorialization sort of like nature of it, the biased nature of it, how they're able to sort of shift opinion, not necessarily always in the greater good of society on something, but really just to do it so that people will watch the ratings kind of thing. And it's like a very razor thin sort of margin and kind of like how you're allowed to sort of navigate that. But I do think that needs to be looked at a lot more closely than people are kind of, I think, willing to right now.
Well, and I also think, like, I'm biased. It's particularly brutal, I think, for women for a lot of reasons. And I think you see that in the documentary, like Britney Spears getting asked in interviews, about her breasts or, just like other really inappropriate, awkward things. And I think that one woman remarked, no boy band would ever get asked questions like that, and how that kind of just missed who she was, even in asking those types of questions. And I think that's really sad. And I think we do see that today. Like you probably mentioned one of the only famous men I can think of that actually gets picked on. Because to me, there's just way more examples that come up of women. Like I just can't really think about that many male celebrities that get dragged that often unless they've done like truly terrible things like Armie Hammer. Like Ben Affleck, I think, is one of those rare ones that just sort of gets like shit for doing nothing. But I think like with women, it's tough because it's so often to do like with our bodies. And I think that's the part that's just sort of like this additional lens, I even think like, Olivia Rodrigo, right? Like I know you played her song for me and now she's kind of continued to have her rise. I saw like last week, now she's getting, shit saying that she's anorexic, and it's like, it's one of those things where it's like you start to even realize, to your point, like the reasons that we need to look at it is because those things get so ingrained in our minds, I think, especially as women, that they then form those thoughts before they happen. And so like I had a really weird moment of like seeing that, but also knowing in that moment that I had already kind of thought that about her. Not that she was anorexic, but thinking like she's very skinny, like in a way where you start to think like, is she too skinny, right? And so when that came out, I was like, I guess that makes sense. But then you also start to think about the fact where like, okay, it's sort of this like self-fulfilling prophecy though, where the media has already kind of trained me to have this thought before it happens. And then a few weeks later, this star is going to get accused of this thing that I've already thought because that's the way the media has trained me to think. And I think like for women, it just sucks and it's really shitty. And like, I'm getting really tired of it.
Yeah. I mean, I think the thing with women in particular is there's this very public maturing that happens with like you have a child star like Drew Barrymore and then everyone's like, oh, that's the cute kid, it's the cute kid, it's the cute kid, it's the cute kid. And then like all of a sudden as she starts to mature and kind of comes into her own, she's in this weird limbo where she's not really that kid anymore, but she's not quite a woman. And I think American society in particular, because we have such a, I don't even know exactly how to like phrase it. It's not like that it's like an awkward perception of it. We just have a very, and it's not even necessarily prudish. We just have a very like unreconciled perception on like how sex and how nudity and how all that type of parts of American society should function that like Europe and sort of the rest of the world, some pockets of the rest of the world like don't have. And so you keep having this like incident where it's like the Olsen twins or people are counting down or Chloe Grace Moretz and people are counting down and like all these sort of like women who like had to sort of mature in the public eye. And so you either kind of have that Drew Barrymore moment where you kind of just go crazy, and I use that word not to be derivative, but just sort of just like, and then you just have a series of like erratic behavior and then you kind of level out at some point like she did, and then now she's like doing phenomenal stuff. Or you do have these like people who just sort of just burn out. They just kind of, the fame and all this kind of stuff. And it's like, I almost wonder to what degree does Hollywood have a mechanism? Because I think right now there's some anti-exploitation stuff for like child actors that I think are in place that are kind of like kind of built so that your parents don't necessarily kind of just like milk you dry and get all like, I don't think they get the money or they get a fraction of it, and it kind of just goes into a trust until they're 18, and then the child can kind of decide, okay, like this is what I'm going to do with the money kind of thing. I think that was kind of brought up either in the documentary or in kind of one of the pundits that I was talking about. But I think the problem is like when you have, and this is why I was talking to you about the Billie Eilish thing and why I like get the perspective of her and other women who've come before her and after her, especially like Miley Cyrus is a perfect example of that, where like she was this like Disney person and she was growing beyond that as a woman, but was sort of like still in the public eye. Hannah Montana, where she was kind of coming into her own, the world was sort of like snapped into the reality of, oh, this is who Miley Cyrus actually is, like not Hannah Montana. And then obviously same cycle, same news, what's going on, blah, 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 blah. Is she in trouble, such and such and such and such. And then she kind of like landed and was like, cool, like this is my style. I'm kind of a little bit like lean this way. And this is kind of my this and this and this and this. And now everyone's like, yeah, that's just Miley Cyrus. And I think there's like the reason why I think that men don't go through that is there's kind of, you're just sort of that kid forever, if that makes sense. And it's like not so much that that's like a pro or a con or whatever. It's like no one's thirsting after, I shouldn't say no one, there'll always be someone, but it's like very few people had a countdown for when Elijah Wood was like, you know, when he was like the cute kid, and then as soon as he turned 18 and then blah, 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 like no one was doing that. And I think that's why you see this like
but that's because
fascination.
Women don't prey upon men the way that men prey upon women. That's why those countdowns exist.
Sure, and that
like,
that may absolutely
don't do that. Women are not like, ooh, is he legal?
I'm saying again, some do to talk about. They're always out there. All I'm trying to say is that like because even when you think about it, they talk about this in the documentary a little bit, where it's like, would it be necessary for Hit Me Baby One More Time to be in that schoolgirl outfit? It's like, that's a very deliberately designed aesthetic that went along with that song and with that video. And I think like the people who kind of put that together understood what was going on. And I think even like, to your point about Christina Aguilera, they kind of tried to clone her into that, and she kind of rebelled very, very early on. That was like, I'm not going to be that girl, and kind of like went left, I think, with that song Dirty. And then since that song, she kind of was her own thing, and she legitimately has like a really powerful voice, so that kind of helped her do that too. But it's like, I think there's just this, very specifically with the music industry, this like, oh, sex sells and that's how we're going to do it sort of thing. And it's like, sure, but then you do have these people who have legitimate like talent and this, that, or the other. And so this is why I was telling, when you and I had that conversation about Billie Eilish, and I was like, Billie Eilish can do whatever she wants. Like, you should just do whatever you want. You should understand, though, again, like what I was saying with Britney Spears and why I actually respect her. Britney Spears is like, yeah, I know. Like, it's like, this is kind of just like how it is, whatever kind of thing. And like, not in like a punk emo kind of way. I think she was just like, yeah, like this is kind of what the industry is. And like, I don't think that was getting to her yet. I think the part that got to her, to circle way back, I don't think it was necessarily the postpartum depression. That very well could be it. I just think it was kind of, I would imagine she was hitting a point where she was like, it would be cool if I could just go to the grocery store with my kid like a normal person. Because I think she mentioned like normal a couple times. It would be cool if I could just take my kid and go to this diner. And I think realizing that was probably never going to happen, I think that's, in my opinion, based on the documentary, probably what started the downward spiral of just like, oh, wait, I can't. It's one thing if it's just me. It's one thing if it's me and people who are my age or people who are in my orbit, like the Justin Timberlake thing and blah, 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 blah. I think it's the realization that it's like, oh, I can't protect my kids from this madness. Okay, now this is a problem.
Yeah, I don't know. I think like I still disagree with you on like the Billie Eilish stuff and the Britney stuff. I think it's just like, I think there's more of a tension that exists for girls. And I think that there was like, one of the women in the documentary said this in terms of like why Britney was so successful. Just the fact that like, you know, when you are a young girl, you're becoming a woman, but you're still like a child too. And then I think they showed like those young girls going into one of her concerts, which I thought was like a funny shot to choose just because they looked so young. But like, I think that is something that maybe boys don't experience in like quite the same way. And I even think the fact that like girls kind of, not all girls, but the fact that even like when you go through puberty, there is an element of it that actually shows to the physical world, right?
Yeah.
Like it kind of starts that sexualization of women at like a young age. And so I think that tension is just so prevalent. And I think that's why, like, from a pop star perspective, like the Billie Eilish stuff to me makes so much sense. And I hate how she gets dragged for stuff like that, because it's like, you can't stop a girl from becoming a woman. Like that just happens. And I think it's such a crazy concept to think that we're going to then like drag those women down and say, oh, well, you need to be a role model when it's like, no, she's becoming a woman. Like, we all know what that means. And we all know what that means when boys become men. So why are women not afforded the same luxury? It's just bonkers to me. It's like, and to me, it's like a very male thing to be like, we're going to just like time capsule her. And like, she needs to be pristine and pure forever because that's how we were first introduced to her. It's just kind of unfair to me because I see that, if you look at like NSYNC, if you look at whoever, like they get to progress in their artistic expression and progress in the ways that they talk about relationships and things like that. You've seen that with Justin Bieber. His music wasn't always as explicit as it is, but no one cares now that he says like the things he says, which like truthfully, he has some pretty explicit music. But I've never seen a headline that said like, oh, Justin Bieber's betraying his fan base because now he's talking about sex all the time. Never seen it. I think you'd be hard pressed to find that headline. Yet flip to like Billie Eilish and like she's being accused of that right now just because she's shown the world she has breasts.
I think the girl in this video I saw the other day that waited at Justin Bieber's home to receive a hug as he came into his apartment would probably disagree with you on everything that you're saying about Justin Bieber. He even politely said to her, he was like, hey, if I'm out, cool. But he's like, this is where I live. He's like, I just want to come home like you just want to come home. This is not cool. Cool? And she's like, yeah, can I have a hug? And then like he just walked past her. I think the only difference between an archetypical male and an archetypical female kind of going through puberty, if you will, is exactly as you said. I think there's like a far greater physical manifestation on like the woman's part. And I think what likely needs to sort of occur is more of a, not for her, like, I forgot the best way to phrase this. This isn't sort of like a keep you in a time capsule thing. I think it's more of a, okay, like where would you like your career to go? And it's like more of a, okay, like, do you want to be known for this, known for this, known for this? And like, so again, you have far more musical catalog in your mind, but I think of like Adele, for instance. I barely have any idea what Adele looks like. I just know what her voice sounds like. And like, to me, that's cool. That's like someone who's just like, yeah, this is my talent. Like, this is what I sound like. This is whatever. That's not everyone, obviously, but like, that's kind of what it is. I've never heard anything. I think there was like the one controversy because she lost weight and everyone's like, what are you doing? Like, cool. I think that's one approach. I think the other approach that I think is sort of a, it's like almost like a wishful thinking kind of paradox that sort of occurs is you have this moment, like the reason why I think we were talking about the Billie Eilish thing when we were, was because it was sort of not just a, okay, she now is starting to like transition into wearing stuff like this. It was you know what, I'm just going to do this like photo shoot and just like put myself out there. And like, again, totally understand like her reasoning for that. That's just like obviously one approach to it. But again, like why I want to go back to like what I was saying about Britney is I think Britney was like, yeah, this is the way the business works. Is this ideal? Absolutely not. Do I wish it was different? Absolutely. But like, I'd rather be focused on what my next tour is going to look like, the way that she was like almost, talking the way that Kanye used to talk about, like, I'm going to do this awesome thing on stage and I'm going to do this and people are never going to have seen this before and they're going to blah, blah, blah. Like, that's what she was focused on. And like, that's why I was kind of like that I respect, because it's almost like she knows I know who I am behind closed doors and when I'm with, her family, when everyone was cool. And I know what like what my brand is. And like, I know that those two things may start to slide, but I'm also very aware of like what my brand is. And it was only when the brand and her started to really be in conflict with all the stuff that was going on behind the scenes that I think it like boiled over and it became a giant issue. And I think it's probably what we're seeing happen with a lot of these people, like the anorexia thing that you were talking about with the woman and all that kind of stuff. I feel like that's kind of stuff where it's like, again, it's like it's like terrible to say, but it's like that's part of the territory kind of thing. It's like you hope that she's healthy, and if she's healthy, like everyone will move on, sort of thing. People are always going to say that stuff. They're always going to try to get the hate clicks. Like even the guy who was like the paparazzi guy, he was like point blank asked, "Do you like?" Did you not realize that she wanted to be left alone? And he kind of like very clearly tap danced around that question, around that answer, and was basically just like, oh, like it's like basically like, this is me putting words in his mouth. It's like, oh, I just want to get my money first, and then I'll figure out if she needs my help, kind of thing, as opposed to just like putting the camera down from the beginning and be like, okay, hey, him, the guy that he's with, hey, like I don't know what's going on, like something like she's, we need to walk away tonight, like kind of thing.
Yeah. I think for me, the saddest thing about this entire, like, and again, like the timeline thing is interesting to examine, but like to think just that she has probably been dealing with this for this period of time, I think is another element of this that is truly like kind of shocking, right? Like we're not talking just about like a couple of years. I think I just can't imagine, I think, being like kind of, to your point, like someone that clearly, had it together, understood her brand, understood how to make money, and people have really been profiting off of her, right? Like that's the sad thing. Like it's kind of like you wonder how her current situation might be different if she was fully in charge of all aspects of her business, right? As someone who clearly was savvy, got the industry, had an artistic vision. It's kind of like, what have we been missing from Britney as a result of this conservatorship, right? And like, yeah, she still has managed to produce great music, but like what might have been if this was not the circumstance that she was under for so long?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's terrible is I think you hit on it earlier, is that you almost were basically saying that she's had even greater music since the conservatorship happened, which I would not be surprised if that is one bullet point amongst many that her team is kind of saying that like that's why she needs to stay under. And it's like under the guise of, hey, she's healthy, she's productive, she's traveling, she's performing, which means that she's exercising, she's doing all these things. Like if we take that away from her, then she might spiral, she might do this and this and this and this. Unbeknownst to like, again, like all of that could very well be true, but then it's also kind of bearing the lead of against her will sort of thing. So it's sort of like one of those where like, if her music tanked immediately afterwards, then people will be like, oh, okay, like she just needs to like sit down. She needs to blah, 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 which is, it's weird because it's almost like, she's cursed with talent then. It's like she is so miserable that she's so kind of like, would rather be anyone else or anywhere else or just all these sort of like types of things. But because she's still so tremendously successful and continues to have this audience and continues to engage them because of, social media and all that kind of stuff, that podcast that they mentioned in the documentary that we're following her and kind of like however many times that she posts. I mean, I didn't see what, I just saw like people kind of start commenting on what was leaked from her testimony. I'd be very curious to see what the judge said. If I can find that to kind of just see like if they have like a summary of why she made the decision to kind of keep this or kind of keep that, whether or not it's just arbitrary kind of, she seems fine, blah, 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 sort of. But I don't know. It's definitely one of those where like I'm very intrigued that something can go on for 13 years and someone can kind of keep working whilst simultaneously being like, I don't want to be doing this. And everyone's kind of like, well, you're legally bound.
Yeah, I just don't think she's had any outlets or any, and I think like, as I think it was Felicia who says at the end, like, she's going to tell her story one day. I think that court testimony is probably just scratching the surface, right? Like it reveals a lot, it validates certain things, but I bet that like at some point we probably, or fingers crossed, I hope, we are going to get the Oprah and Britney sit down. Like that is what I will be waiting for. Like the 2-hour special where we just get to hear like exactly what went down, what she was living with. Like, I do think that that is in our future.
I don't want an Oprah sit down. You know who I want to sit down with.
No, ew. Are you seriously about to say Joe Rogan right now?
I want a 3-hour Britney Spears, Joe Rogan conversation, because if you watch him talk with like even like Robert Downey Jr., Robert Downey Jr. is probably the most famous person he's out there, especially like close to like the fame. It was like right after Endgame. I actually like you and he said this himself, where he's just like 3 hours is a long time to pretend to be something. Like he's like, you will stumble out, fall out, trip out, come out at some point during those 3 hours. And like sometimes you get that like viral Elon Musk moment, and then sometimes you get someone who's just like, look, man, like even like Bernie Sanders, I think when he was on there, like he kept doing the talking points, and like by like hour 2 he stopped doing that, and he was actually telling you why he wanted to be president and what he thought about issues and how they should change and blah blah blah. So I would like to see her do something like that, if only because, especially in the documentary, when they're talking to the brother, and the brother's kind of like, yeah, she seems fine, and it's just like, this is wild, man. Like I was like, can you even imagine if like you are publicly imprisoned and like no one believes you, and like every time someone asks your like parents or like your siblings, probably even like your kids, and they're just like, yeah, she's fine, and you're like screaming out and like internally screaming, but also just outwardly being like, hey, I want out, and everyone's like, oh, you're fine. That is insane. And I'm kind of like worried for her from like a standpoint of like, everyone's like, oh, did Epstein kill himself? Did like McAfee kill himself? Like, it's like, that's more of like after this of why I'm like, oh, this is, they need to like let her out kind of thing, and let her just like be the wife to whoever this man is, and like raise her kids, and like let her do this thing, because it's like, to your point, there's a year of this, and then there's a decade of this, and like I cannot imagine, as her biological clock is ticking and all that kind of stuff, because that's something that she's been talking about since like she was like 20. I can't imagine this ending in any form positive. She doesn't get out of this conservatorship in the next like year.
Yeah. I mean, I really hope for her sake she does. I hope that there can be, I don't know, it was really actually kind of sad in the last few days. I don't know if you saw the memes of like, we asked the universe to free Britney and they released Bill Cosby instead.
Yeah.
There've been some pretty epic ones, but it's like, even that makes me sad, right? Because I'm like laughing at them, but like, it's not funny. Like when you really think about it, it's just sort of like, what is it going to take for her to get out of this? And like the fact that meanwhile sex offenders are being released, it's kind of just like, it's a tough pill to swallow. And I think truthfully, once again, it's sort of indicative of, I think sometimes the ways that women are treated in our society. And I think especially from like a legal perspective, it can be very tough for women in the legal system. So yeah, I fear for her. I hope you're not right. I hope that it comes a lot sooner than that. But it's just really unfortunate to think about someone that, has so much talent and is still so young, having to live in this way.
Yeah, I do, as we somewhat wind down here, want to mention Craig Ferguson, because I actually do remember him saying the moment that like has been going viral recently. I used to watch him kind of passively a little bit, but I do remember when people were kind of giving him flack for like not wanting to make fun of Britney Spears, and I would kind of use this moment to encourage people, because one of the things that I have in here that I was going to ask you is like, do you think society has learned to understand first and judge later? Obviously not, but like, if not, sort of like, why not? Because of the Craig Ferguson sort of example of him just kind of like seeing this person and kind of just being like, oh, I actually like, I've been there kind of thing. Like, I get that. Like, I actually understand like what she's going through. He, listeners, for those who don't know the context of Craig Ferguson filled in for Craig Kilborn. If you don't know who Craig Kilborn is, CBS's late night show during the years of, Leno and Letterman and et cetera.
Wait, do you mean Craig Ferguson though, or Stephen Colbert?
Craig Ferguson.
But Stephen Colbert are you talking about the video with her songs?
No. So Craig Ferguson, basically when the weekend that the shaved head stuff happened, Craig Ferguson, I think on like Monday on his show, basically kind of told people, he was like, hey, I know, basically, this is me paraphrase. He's like, I know that, and again, I would encourage everyone who hasn't seen it to look it up. It's like one of the few times you're going to see someone who could have made the easy joke not make it. And he basically just says, hey, like, you know, I'm 15 years sober. And he's like, I don't think Britney Spears has an alcohol problem, but like, she needs help. He's like, very clearly, she needs help. I needed help.
Oh, okay. I do know what you're talking about. Yeah.
And I think what we need, and again, why I was saying why I get like agitated when people make these apologies like years and 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 years later, is I think we just need more people in the moment to kind of just be more mature, even if it might be like a ding on their brand kind of thing. Whether that's the Me Too stuff, whether that's, you know, whatever. I think, you know, obviously with the Me Too stuff, and you and I talked about how like some men tried to come forward and then, you know, all of a sudden like something that happened in their past from 20 years ago came up, and they basically, like, all men were like, all right, we're going to stay out of this because we don't know kind of thing. I just feel like there's definitely like people need to sort of say something when it's happening. And I know that that's like a very easy thing to say. Like no one knows if they're going to be able to do it until they kind of they're in that moment. But I just want to kind of definitely for people to go and watch that Craig Ferguson thing, because I think it's a very important sort of example of just like someone being like, cool, I don't need to join in. Even if it's like, you know, you and your friends kind of like making fun of something, you don't have to join in. You don't have to sort of just like laugh at the joke or whatever. You can kind of like steer them away from it and kind of move on. I just think that was really cool. That Craig Ferguson was basically just like, yep, I know that everyone else is doing monologues about it and doing punchlines about it. And I know that she's in the tabloids, and I know this and this and this and this and this, but like at the core of it, this is a woman who's 25 with 2 kids and is clearly drowning in all of this fame right now, and like someone needs to like actually help her. And I think that like I saw a story recently that was like they were like, Britney must have seen it, because I think he was in either a movie or something. I think he was like in an animated movie or something like that. And they wanted to use Hit Me Baby One More Time, and apparently this was like, you know, obviously at the time just astronomical to get. No one was allowed to use it, and that production was given it for free. And like no one really, like there was no communication. They just kind of always assumed it was because she saw it and was like, oh, that was like the one person that was like didn't kick me while I was down, sort of thing. So I thought that was pretty cool.
I hope that's true.
Yeah. Last thing for you, what do you think happens now, and what do you hope happens now?
I think what happens now is that we're going to focus on this for like a couple of weeks, and then I think sadly it's probably going to fade to the background. I think it'll pop up again every time she has to go back to court. I think that recently I heard a request that they had made prior to like that court testimony she had. So I think like a request from a few months ago was recently denied. But I think what they were trying to say was like that had, you know, nothing to do with the recent court testimony. So I hope, you know, that she's not going to give up in fighting this. And I hope that the media can, you know, work in her favor this time. And I think I would call upon the people, especially the ones that I believe, you know, are kind of a little bit inauthentic in speaking up now, like the Justin Timberlakes of the world. You know, like that's great that he said something now, but like let's see him continue to kind of talk about this, right? And be an ally to her and kind of keep the pressure on, because I think that, you know, he has a lot to kind of answer for too. And I think, you know, I'm sure like for him, he's done a lot of growing up, and I'm sure, you know, reflection as well. But I think, you know, he did play a big part in kind of some of her issues, and, you know, to kind of go back to the title of the documentary, in the framing of her, you know. Crimea River is still just such a like crazy thing to think about for that reason, you know. And I remember when that song came out, because again, I was already following the Britney narrative, and like that's another thing that I felt complicit in at that time, was like listening to that song and being like, ooh, burn, you know. And like I definitely remember amongst my friend group, we all believed that Justin Timberlake got cheated on. And like who really knows? And like and even if he did, like, did she deserve that music video and then the media narrative that followed? I don't think so, right? And then Justin obviously goes on to do, the Janet Jackson scandal after that. And it's kind of like, I hope that people like that actually, had a hand, but that also have some power now to maybe help, reach out either privately or publicly and continue to offer that support to her, in the hopes that this does end for her soon. And I also am intrigued to know, again, there is still a lot we don't know. So like some of her claims around, her not being able to have children, Jamie Spears and some of his legal people, I think, have already come out trying to combat that theory. And then you still have to ask yourself, though, like, okay, well, then where is she getting that idea from, right? So I think there's a lot of things that we hopefully will get clarity on. And yeah, I hope it ends soon for her.
Yeah, I don't think she's going to get out of it. And I think that has more to do with everything that has nothing to do with her. And what I mean by that is, like, I think that lawyer that they asked point blank, have you ever known of someone who's been able to successfully get out of a conservatorship? And she was just like, no. She's like, it's actually quite difficult, almost if not impossible to do. I think legally, if she's able to get out of it, it's going to set a precedent that's going to like light the legal world on fire. That's not fair to Britney, but I think that's probably, if my guess of like why the courts aren't doing more, why they're not kind of like, okay, because like one of the things I was curious about that didn't come up in the documentary, I was like, there seems like there should be criteria that needs to be met, because that's my understanding of rehab, and that's my understanding of just like any situation that's like court appointed. It's like, once you do A, B, and C, can you demonstrate that you've done A, B, and C? Okay, the person who is responsible for making sure that you're doing A, B, and C, do you corroborate that they've done A, B, and C? Okay, cool, you're good to go. And like, there's no criteria for her. And so you're, again, like, why I'm saying this may be more of a legal issue that like everyone's trying to like protect the precedent of, is because this is indefinite as far as we know. And I can imagine being someone who's like 70 years old or 80 years old or 90 years old being like, cool, like, I'm fine. You guys think that day I had is worth putting me in this situation for the rest of my life. I am fine. This may cause like weird legal ramifications. And that's why I'm like, I think that this is not going to be overturned. Now, what I hope happens, obviously that it does get overturned, but I actually hope that like some of these major news networks, someone at least has like a legit reckoning, not so much like, fire people, blah, 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 but just like someone who's just like, hey, due to the Britney Spears thing, we've been like taking a look at the way that we've been reporting the news for like the last like 10 years, 15 years, and like times when we overindulged into sensationalism, when we like kicked people when they were down, when they did this and this and this, and like we're going to strive not to do that anymore. Like, there's no need for us to do that. We're here to bring you the news. We're here to bring you investigative news. We're here to bring you insights into like humanity and like our future and the things that like choice, like that kind of thing. It's a very like newsroom from HBO show, kind of like that's what they sort of basically tried to do. I would like to see that. That's what I hope happens. But as I said, I think that there's going to be a much more like legal protection that has nothing to do with Britney that's going to keep her locked in this, unfortunately.
I hope not.
No.
I feel like they're going to probably try and like, come out and then state whatever the mental health issues are or something like that. But like, I guess the reason I'm hopeful she'll get out is like, I would assume that there's some sort of procedure then where she gets evaluated. And I feel like, I mean, again, I'm not a lawyer, but you would think that if, you can prove that someone is stable and in command of their own business and able to understand all of that, then like, what sort of reasoning does there become for this conservatorship to continue?
It's also very indicative to me of the way that people were talking about sort of like Trump, that once he's not the president, that they may be able to come after him in ways that they weren't as president. And I can imagine Jamie Spears in particular and some of these other people. I think that's why the management company was like, you know what? I think we're good. Like that wealth management company, they backed out. And I think a few other people have sort of like backed out or like lessened the role. I think everyone's hyper aware that this may blow up. And if it blows up, it's not going to be like Jamie Spears just being like, oh, okay, she's good. It's going to be like, okay, now that we realize that you have been exploiting, we'll just call it, your daughter for 13 years, you're all going to jail kind of thing. And I think that's like one of those where, like, again, like, this scheme has probably gone on for too long for everyone to kind of just like let it go. Like, I think we're past greed. We're past, I care about my daughter. We're past blah, 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 blah. I think kind of like, as I think one of the articles I was reading about, that was trying to summarize her statement. I think this is legitimately like, there's a legal precedent that I was just talking about. And then I think I think if this does fall apart, you're going to have a lot of people who are going to go to jail. So I think that's going to be, I think that's a lot of what's driving this, because when you really look at the surface of this, it's not so much that there's like everyone made enough money, like we can relax now. I think there's like a very, to your point about like him coming out and combating, no, she's fine. No, she's fine. Like, something is going to have to, like, someone with enough power will likely try to like intervene, if that's even legally possible, to just basically be like, okay, like, what's going on here? What's the criteria? Here's an independent third party that's going to come in and evaluate her or something like that. But I don't know, we'll see. It'll definitely be interesting to kind of keep track of, now that it has sort of public opinion, especially in its favor, which usually is how anything gets done in American society and usually global society.
Hashtag free Britney.
Yep. Hashtag restore the Snyderverse. Anything else? Stuff that you saw, stuff that you read, speculation, pundits, any of that?
No, I mean, I would recommend this one, I think, to anyone that just wants to understand a little bit more about what they're seeing in the news and might not know. And I think if you do know, and you're someone that followed her story from the beginning, this might recontextualize a lot of it for you, might reframe it even, and make you think a little bit differently about, that time period and the role that we all kind of played in, trials and tribulations that she's had to face in her career. So I would definitely recommend this one.
Yeah, I mean, I would recommend this as well, under the guise that slavery in modern times comes in many, many forms. One of the things I used to talk about when I was working for minimum wage for many years after the financial crisis, and I would kind of talk to folks, and I would kind of basically just say, hey, I think it's a really fascinating, and this is kind of the conversation that was, I presume, is happening during the $15 minimum wage conversations, where it's like you're making enough to simply find a place to sleep and then go back to work. You're not making enough to save. You're not making enough to get out of that situation. You're barely making enough to eat. You're barely making enough. Basically, all you're doing is surviving so that you can go to work. So, like, potentially, again, slavery comes in many forms. In this instance, just because Britney is making ridiculous amounts of money and she is touring and she has this husband and she does this, has her pre-existing children and she's able to travel and go and to and fro and all these types of things, does not mean that she has freedom. And I think that's like a really heavy thing that people should like think about, of just, if you wanted something to end and the world is basically telling you no, that's a very interesting and heavy concept to just like hold. Don't think about the money, don't think about the this, that, or the other. Just like, I don't want to do this anymore, and you're being told that you can't. And that's like a wild concept to me that, again, as we talked about for quite a while, that is playing out in the public eye and doesn't seem to be causing any legal pushback. So definitely worth a watch because of that.
Yeah, I think if anything, that's indicative of probably her strength. I think the more we'll understand about, how healthy she is in her current state, the more, to me, that will just sort of reflect how strong of a person she was to have kind of gotten through this time and not have lost her mind completely. Because I think for a weaker person, that could be a really tough structure to be living under.
Yeah. So again, Britney Spears on Joe Rogan. Let's make that happen.
Let's please not. And so just so the listeners know, it's not that I'm opposed to long form interview content. I'm opposed to 3 hours of Joe Rogan.
And with that, ladies and gentlemen, my fellow feathers in arms, that is episode number 9. As you mentioned up top, if you enjoyed what you heard tonight, help us keep it going by supporting us over at patreon.com/Pandora's Quack. Feel free to share, rate, and review us on the free podcasting service of your choice, and stick around for Pandora's Quack's other upcoming shows. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, listeners. Nicole, where does one go after Miss Spears? The
Paris Hilton documentary.
That is a genuine question, listeners. And both you and us will find out next time. This podcast was produced by Pandora's Quack. She's Nicole Matthews, and you can follow her at...
You can follow me on Twitter at Nicole Matthews and on Instagram at Marie Coley.
And I'm Brandan Jones, and you can follow me on Twitter or Vero at Lamar Diablo. And these are the rabbit holes that quack. Good night.